A wealthy woman's perfect night at a charity gala takes a shocking turn when she publicly berates a black waitress over a minor inconvenience. But just as she savors her sense of superiority, the truth behind that waitress's identity is revealed, and it's a revelation that will shake her to her core. Who is this woman she so cruelly dismissed, and why will it leave her regretting her actions forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The kitchen of the Magnolia Estate buzzed with activity as servers rushed back and forth, their shoes clicking against the polished floor. Steam rose from warming trays, and the clinking of plates and utensils filled the air. Ava Reynolds, Ava, 35, a tall, graceful black woman with deep brown skin and sharp eyes, moved with practiced ease among her staff, her natural grace undiminished by the fast-paced environment. "Ms. Reynolds, you really don't have to help," Jack, the head chef, said as he artfully arranged tiny pastries on a silver tray. "We can manage." Ava smiled warmly as she adjusted her simple black blouse. "Now, Jack, you know that's not how we do things here. When someone needs help, we step up." "Besides," Ava continued, reaching for a clean apron, "Jessica's got the fever, and this Carter Foundation Gala is one of our biggest events of the year. We need all hands on deck." She tied the apron around her waist and got to work, her movements quick and efficient. The kitchen smelled of herbs and butter as trays of carefully crafted appetizers emerged from the ovens. Ava helped plate the delicate mushroom tartlets, making sure each one was perfectly centered on its serving dish. Through the kitchen swinging doors, the sound of string music and pleasant conversation drifted in. The main ballroom was filling up with guests in expensive evening wear, all there to support local education initiatives. Ava felt a familiar pride well up in her chest, pride in her venue, in her team, and in how far she'd come from her humble beginnings in a small southern town. "Ms. Reynolds?" Gia, one of the younger servers, approached with worry creasing her forehead. "The crab cakes are running low out there, and people keep asking for them." "Don't worry, honey," Ava reassured her, gesturing to a warming drawer. "We prepared extra knowing they'd be popular. Let's get those plated up." As they worked together, Ava showed Gia how to arrange the crab cakes just so, adding tiny sprigs of fresh herbs for garnish. "Remember," she said softly, "presentation matters almost as much as taste. We want our guests to feel special from the moment they see the food." The kitchen door swung open, and Michael, the venue's event coordinator, poked his head in. "Ava, you're a lifesaver tonight," he said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "The Carter Foundation people are over the moon about everything." "That's what we aim for," Ava replied, carefully arranging the last of the crab cakes. She stepped back to survey the kitchen, making sure everything was running smoothly. The staff moved like a well-oiled machine, each person knowing their role and executing it perfectly. Ava picked up a large silver tray loaded with an assortment of hors d'oeuvres. The weight felt familiar in her hands, bringing back memories of her first job as a server, long before she'd ever dreamed of owning her own venue. She straightened her shoulders and checked her reflection in a passing stainless steel surface, making sure her short, natural curls were neat. "I'll take this round out," she announced, pushing the kitchen door open with her hip. The elegant ballroom opened up before her, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. The space that she'd lovingly restored from a run-down old mansion now shone like a jewel, its hardwood floors gleaming and its crown molding expertly restored. As she stepped into the room, Ava began making her way through the crowd, offering appetizers with a genuine smile. "Good evening," she greeted warmly to each guest she passed. The grand entrance doors of the Magnolia Estate swung open, and Caroline Prescott, 50, a wealthy white woman with meticulously styled blonde hair, swept in like a winter storm, Her emerald green designer gown rustled with each determined step, and diamonds sparkled at her throat and ears, catching the warm light from the crystal chandeliers above. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elaborate style that must have taken hours to perfect. Yet her face wore an expression that suggested she'd just bitten into something sour. She paused just inside the doorway, her critical gaze sweeping across the room. The carefully arranged tables draped in cream-colored linens, the tasteful floral centerpieces, and the expertly positioned lighting seemed to offend her somehow. Her perfectly manicured fingers clutched her designer clutch a little tighter as she spotted Michael, the event coordinator, directing some guests to their seats. "Michael!" she called out sharply, her voice cutting through the pleasant murmur of conversation. "Michael, come here at once." Michael hurried over, his professional smile firmly in place. "Good evening, Mrs. Prescott. You look lovely this evening. How can I help you?" Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line as she consulted the small place card in her hand. "Table 14? There must be some mistake." She gestured toward the back half of the room where her assigned table sat. "Why is my table so far from the stage? This is unacceptable." Michael maintained his composure, though a bead of sweat appeared at his temple. "I apologize, Mrs. Prescott, but the seating arrangement was carefully planned according to the Foundation's specifications. I'm afraid we can't—" "Can't?" Caroline interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "I've donated more to this foundation than half the people in this room combined. I should be seated where I can properly see and be seen." She glanced around the room again, her displeasure evident in every line of her face. Several nearby guests pretended not to notice the exchange, but Caroline's voice carried enough to draw uncomfortable glances. She either didn't notice or didn't care about the attention she was attracting. "Perhaps," Michael began diplomatically, "I could speak with the Foundation's event coordinator about—" "Don't bother," Caroline cut him off again, waving her hand dismissively. "I'll handle it myself. Though I must say I expected better from this venue. The Riverside Club would never have made such an egregious error." She started toward her assigned table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like punctuation marks to her irritation. The guests she passed seemed to shrink away slightly, as if her bad mood might be contagious. Settling into her chair with obvious reluctance, Caroline surveyed the room with narrowed eyes. She noticed Ava moving through the crowd, stopping here and there to straighten a place setting or adjust a flower arrangement. Without missing a beat, Ava was also graciously offering hors d'oeuvres to guests while engaging them in warm conversation. Caroline's lip curled slightly as she watched. She raised her hand, gesturing imperiously at Ava as if summoning a servant. "You there?" she called out, not bothering to hide her disdain. "I have some issues that need addressing immediately." Ava approached Caroline's table with her characteristic grace, maintaining a warm, professional smile despite the dismissive gesture that had summoned her. "Good evening, ma'am. How may I assist you?" Caroline lifted her water glass, holding it up to the light as if examining evidence in a crime scene. "This water is room temperature," she announced, her voice pitched to Carrie. "And there's no lemon. I always have my water with lemon. Always." She set the glass down with enough force to make the silverware rattle. How difficult is it to get such a simple thing right? "I apologize for the oversight," Ava said softly. "I'll bring you fresh water with lemon right away." "Don't bother apologizing," Caroline snapped, her perfectly lined lips curling into a sneer. "What good does an apology do? Clearly you're untrained for this kind of event. This is a charity gala, not some backyard barbecue." A flush crept up Ava's neck, but her expression remained composed. She stood straight, her hands clasped professionally in front of her, as Caroline continued her tirade. "I mean, really," Caroline went on, her voice growing louder, "the service here is absolutely incompetent. First, they seat me at the wrong table, and now I can't even get proper water service." She looked around at the other guests as if seeking agreement. Most avoided her gaze, though a few nodded weakly. The muscles in Ava's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I understand your frustration, ma'am. I'll take care of this right away." "You should have taken care of it before I had to point it out," Caroline said, her words sharp as glass. "This is basic service. Basic. But I suppose that's what happens when venues hire—" She paused, her gaze sweeping over Ava's dark skin with obvious disdain, leaving the rest of her sentence unspoken, but clear as day. Ava felt the sting of Caroline's words and implications deep in her chest, but years of experience had taught her how to weather such moments with dignity. She took a slow, careful breath before speaking. "I sincerely apologize for not meeting your expectations," Ava said, her voice calm and clear. "I'll have someone bring you fresh water with lemon immediately." She maintained eye contact with Caroline for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, her steps measured and deliberate. As Ava's back retreated, Caroline's voice carried across the now silent section. "This place should hire better staff." She picked up her menu, seemingly oblivious to the uncomfortable atmosphere she had created and the disapproving looks from nearby guests. The evening progressed, and the main course plates were being cleared away. Caroline checked her diamond-studded watch for the 5th time in as many minutes, drumming her perfectly manicured nails against the pristine white tablecloth. The other guests at her table had received their desserts, delicate slices of chocolate mousse cake garnished with fresh berries, but her plate remained conspicuously absent. Her face flushed red with anger as she watched Ava coordinating with other servers across the room. Caroline's hand shot up, waving imperiously. When Ava didn't immediately notice, Caroline's voice cut through the gentle dinner conversation like a knife. "Excuse me. Yes, you." Caroline's voice carried across the room. "This is absolutely ridiculous. Where is my dessert?" Ava made her way over, her shoulders straight despite the weight of Caroline's hostile glare. "I apologize for the delay, ma'am. Let me check on that right away." "Check on it? You should have been monitoring it." Caroline's voice rose higher. "Everyone else at my table has been served. What kind of establishment are you running here?" The pleasant chatter around them died down as heads turned toward the commotion. Caroline stood up, her emerald dress catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. "I've had enough of this treatment," she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "First the water, then the seating, and now this? Is this how you treat all your guests, or just the ones who actually matter?" Ava remained still, her face a mask of professional calm, even as Caroline stepped closer. "But what else should I expect?" Caroline's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I suppose this is what happens when people like you try to run an upscale venue. Some things are clearly," she paused deliberately, "beyond your capabilities." The racial undertone in her words hung heavy in the air. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Glasses froze halfway to lips. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Ava felt dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable, a few even angry on her behalf. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, feel the familiar ache of having to swallow such blatant prejudice with grace. Taking a deep, centering breath, Ava met Caroline's gaze steadily. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and dignified, carrying easily across the silent room without being raised. "I'll ensure this is fixed immediately, ma'am." She turned and walked away, her steps measured and graceful, leaving Caroline standing alone in the spotlight of her own making. As Ava moved through the room, whispers began to ripple through the crowd, the sound of dozens of conversations starting at once, all focused on what they had just witnessed. The gentle tapping of a spoon against crystal glass cut through the murmurs, drawing everyone's attention to the stage. Marcus Bennett, the evening's master of ceremonies, stepped up to the microphone, his silver hair gleaming under the spotlights. He adjusted his bow tie and smiled warmly at the assembled guests. Ladies and gentlemen, as we near the end of this wonderful evening, I'd like to take a moment to recognize those who have made tonight's fundraiser possible. He gestured to the elaborate decorations surrounding them. First, I must express our gratitude to the Magnolia Estate for hosting us in this stunning venue. Caroline settled back into her chair, dabbing at her mouth with her napkin, still visibly irritated from the earlier confrontation. She barely paid attention as Marcus began listing donors and their contributions. And now, Marcus continued, his voice taking on an especially warm tone, I'd like to recognize someone who exemplifies the spirit of giving that brings us all here tonight. Not only has she provided this beautiful venue, but she has also made an extraordinary personal contribution to our cause. Caroline's attention shifted slightly, expecting to hear about some wealthy socialite she knew from her circles. Please welcome to the stage the co-owner of the Magnolia Estate and one of our most generous donors this evening, Ms. Ava Reynolds. The room erupted in applause. Caroline's hand froze mid-reach for her water glass, her eyes widening in shock. She watched as Ava, the same woman she had just berated as staff, emerged from the crowd and made her way toward the stage. Ava's transformation was subtle but striking. She had removed her simple black serving attire, revealing an elegant navy blue evening gown underneath. A delicate pearl necklace graced her neck, and her natural hair was styled in a sophisticated updo. She carried herself with the same grace she'd shown all evening, but now it radiated with undeniable authority. Caroline's face drained of color as she watched Ava climb the steps to the stage. The same woman she had dismissed as untrained and incompetent now stood before the crowd, commanding the attention of every person in the room. The whispers around Caroline's table grew louder, and she felt the weight of judgmental glances from her fellow guests. Ava took her place at the podium, the spotlight illuminating her features as she surveyed the room with quiet confidence. The applause continued, growing stronger as several guests rose to their feet in appreciation. Caroline remained seated, her hands limp in her lap, her face ashen as the full impact of her earlier behavior began to sink in. The contrast between Ava's dignified presence on stage and Caroline's earlier treatment of her hung heavy in the air. Some guests were now openly staring at Caroline, their expressions a mix of disapproval and schadenfreude. She shrank slightly in her chair, her earlier bravado completely evaporated as Ava prepared to address the crowd. Caroline stood frozen for several minutes after Ava's speech, her emerald gown suddenly feeling too tight, too conspicuous. The other guests had begun to disperse, moving toward the dessert tables or gathering in small groups to chat, but many still cast sideways glances in her direction. Their whispers felt like tiny needles pricking at her skin. With trembling fingers, she smoothed down her dress and took a deep breath. The weight of her earlier behavior pressed down on her shoulders as she made her way across the polished marble floor toward where Ava stood speaking with some donors. Caroline waited at the edge of the group, shifting from foot to foot. Her usual confidence completely evaporated. She watched as Ava graciously thanked each person, her smile genuine and warm. The same smile she had maintained even while Caroline had berated her earlier. When the last donor moved away, Caroline stepped forward. Her throat felt dry, and her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. "Ms. Reynolds," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Ava turned to face her, her expression neutral but attentive. The pearl necklace caught the light as she moved, and Caroline noticed for the first time how it complemented the quiet elegance of her entire appearance. Caroline's words stumbled over each other. Her hands fidgeted with her clutch purse, opening and closing the clasp repeatedly. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry for earlier. The surrounding conversation seemed to dim as Ava regarded her steadily. The same poise that Caroline had mistaken for subservience now radiated authority and grace. When Ava spoke, her voice was clear and measured, carrying the same dignity she had shown throughout the evening, even in the face of Caroline's abuse. I didn't need your apology when you thought I was just a waitress, Ava said firmly. I don't need it now. The fallout from the gala spread through their social circle like wildfire. Within days, Caroline's phone grew eerily quiet, her usually bustling social calendar suddenly empty. The few text messages she received were terse and formal, a stark contrast to the usual stream of emoji-filled conversations. At La Maison, her favorite French bistro, Caroline sat across from Margaret, her closest friend of 20 years. Caroline pushed her untouched salad around the plate, the vinaigrette forming tiny pools at the edges. Did you see the email from the Children's Hospital Board? Margaret asked, her voice low and careful. She dabbed at her lips with a crisp white napkin, avoiding direct eye contact. Caroline's shoulders tensed. They're postponing the annual fundraiser planning meeting, again. The third postponement in 2 weeks, though she didn't mention that part. Margaret set down her fork with a gentle clink. Caroline, we need to talk about what happened at the Magnolia estate. It was just a misunderstanding, Caroline insisted, her fingers tightening around her water glass. I've already tried to apologize. It's more than that. Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. People are sharing videos. That comment you made? She trailed off, letting the unspoken words hang heavy between them. Caroline's chest tightened. I didn't mean. Intent doesn't matter anymore, Margaret cut in, unusually firm. The damage is done. The hospital board, the symphony committee, even the garden club, they're all talking. They can't just freeze me out, Caroline protested, but her voice wavered. I've raised millions for them over the years. Margaret reached across the table, patting Caroline's hand with genuine sympathy. Maybe it's best if you stay out of the spotlight for a while. People are talking. The drive home to her mansion felt longer than usual. Caroline's hands gripped the steering wheel of her Mercedes too tightly, her knuckles white against the leather. The sprawling house, usually a symbol of her success, now felt like a gilded cage. In her private sitting room, Caroline poured herself a generous glass of Cabernet, the rich red liquid catching the late afternoon light. The room's elegant furnishings, the antique chaise, the crystal chandelier, the collection of rare art pieces, suddenly seemed to mock her. She stopped in front of the ornate mirror that dominated one wall, studying her reflection. Her carefully maintained appearance was still perfect. Not a hair out of place, makeup flawless, designer outfit immaculate. But something had changed in her eyes. Why does everyone care so much? She murmured, her voice tinged with confusion and bitterness. The words echoed slightly in the empty room, unanswered. Ava sat cross-legged on her living room couch, a steaming mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. The soft glow of table lamps created a cozy atmosphere, but her mind kept replaying the events from the gala. Naomi, a vibrant 37-year-old with curly black hair who was Ava's best friend and business partner, perched on the adjacent armchair. Her curly black hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing comfortable yoga pants and an oversized sweater. I can't believe she had the nerve to treat you like that, Naomi said, shaking her head. In our own venue, no less. Ava took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth soothe her. You know what's funny? I wasn't even surprised. Just disappointed. She set the mug down on the coffee table, running her fingers along its smooth ceramic surface. "Girl, you handled it with more grace than I would have," Naomi replied, leaning forward. "If it were me—" "I know," Ava smiled softly. "You would have put her in her place right there." The ceiling fan hummed quietly above them as Ava gathered her thoughts. "You remember that boutique downtown? The one where the owner followed me around like I was going to steal something?" Naomi nodded, her expression darkening at the memory. "Or that time at the bank when they questioned the legitimacy of our business loan application?" Ava continued, her voice steady but tinged with old pain. "I thought people like her didn't affect me anymore. I thought I'd built up enough armor." "Ava, honey," Naomi said gently, moving to sit beside her friend on the couch. "You shouldn't have to wear armor at all." Ava looked around her tastefully decorated living room at the framed photos of family and friends, the awards from local business associations, the certificate from their first successful event at the Magnolia Estate. Each item represented a victory, a step forward. "You know what hurts the most?" Ava's voice grew quiet. "It's not just about me. Every time something like this happens, I think about my nieces, about all the young black girls out there. They deserve better than this." Naomi wrapped an arm around Ava's shoulders, pulling her close. "They do. And they have role models like you showing them what's possible." Ava wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her best efforts. "Sometimes I wonder if anything really changes. We own this beautiful venue. We've made it successful. We give back to the community. And still, someone like Caroline Prescott takes one look at me and sees nothing but a servant." "But look at what happened after," Naomi pointed out. "The community rallied around you. People spoke up. That wouldn't have happened 20 years ago." Ava stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the twinkling city lights below. Her reflection stared back at her, strong and determined despite the evening's vulnerability. The hurt was still there, a familiar ache in her chest, but something else was growing alongside it. Purpose. "Change doesn't happen without action," Ava said softly, more to herself than to Naomi. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Café Laurent, casting a warm glow on the pristine white tablecloths. Caroline sat across from Margot, who was Caroline's closest friend, stirring her untouched cappuccino with practiced precision. Her usually perfect posture showed signs of strain, and dark circles lurked beneath her expertly applied concealer. "I just don't understand why everyone's making such a big deal about this," Caroline said, her voice tight with frustration. She adjusted her silk scarf for the third time in 5 minutes. The service was clearly subpar. Margot took a deliberate sip of her espresso, her sharp eyes studying her friend over the rim of the cup. "Caroline—" "No, listen," Caroline interrupted, leaning forward. "If anything, she's the one who made it about race. I was simply pointing out legitimate concerns about the service." The quiet murmur of other diners filled the awkward pause as Margot set down her cup with a soft clink. Around them, the usual crowd of well-heeled ladies chatted over their brunch, but Caroline noticed how several of them carefully avoided looking in her direction. "The whole thing was completely misunderstood," Caroline continued, her voice rising slightly. "And now everyone's acting like I'm some sort of monster." She dabbed at her lips with her napkin, though she hadn't touched her food. "Besides, how was I supposed to know she owned the place?" "That's exactly the problem," Margot said, but Caroline pressed on. "And then she had the nerve to reject my apology. I tried to make it right, but she just had to make a scene about it." Caroline's fingers drummed against the table. "She's probably loving all this attention she's getting now." Margot's perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together. "Are you even hearing yourself?" "What?" "I'm just saying." "No," Margot cut in. setting her cup down with more force than necessary. "You're not just saying anything. You're trying to twist this situation to make yourself the victim." Caroline's face flushed. "I am the victim. My reputation is being dragged through the mud because this woman decided to be overly sensitive about a few comments about service quality." "A few comments?" Margot's voice took on an edge that Caroline rarely heard. "I was there, Caroline. We all heard what you said. Those weren't comments about service quality." "Well, if she had just—" "Caroline," Margot interrupted, her tone sharp enough to make Caroline flinch. "The world doesn't work that way anymore. You need to own up to what you said." Ava attends a community meeting and discusses plans to expand a scholarship program for marginalized youth. The community center buzzed with energy as residents filled the worn but well-loved meeting room. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating particles dancing in the air. Ava stood at the front, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Last year, we helped 15 students attend college," Ava said, gesturing to the presentation slides behind her. "This year, we have the opportunity to double that number." Naomi sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly as she took notes on her tablet. The room was packed with familiar faces, teachers, local business owners, and parents who'd been part of the community for generations. "The Magnolia Estate's success means we can do more," Ava continued, her voice warm with passion. "Every child deserves a chance to pursue their dreams, regardless of their zip code or family income." Mrs. Jenkins, a retired school teacher, raised her hand. "How can we help, dear?" Ava smiled, pulling up the next slide. "We need mentors, tutors, and internship opportunities. But most importantly, we need your stories. Many of these kids don't see examples of success that look like them or come from where they come from." The meeting continued with practical discussions about fundraising and program logistics. Ava watched as people formed small groups, exchanging contact information and brainstorming ideas. This was what she'd always dreamed of: community members coming together, breaking down barriers, creating real change. After the meeting, as volunteers stacked chairs and gathered materials, Naomi approached Ava. "That was incredible," she said, bumping her shoulder against Ava's. "You had them eating out of your hand." Ava chuckled, gathering her papers. "It's not about me. Did you see how excited everyone got when we started talking about mentorship opportunities? This is the work that matters." "Speaking of work," Naomi said, helping Ava pack up her laptop, "the venue's booked solid for the next 3 months. We might need to look at hiring more staff." "Good problem to have," Ava replied, zipping up her bag. She paused to thank Mr. Rodriguez, who'd offered to provide catering for their next fundraising event. As they walked to their cars, Ava's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting another message about the upcoming foundation meeting. Instead, she froze mid-step. "What is it?" Naomi asked, noticing her friend's expression. Ava stared at her phone screen, where Caroline Prescott's name glowed brightly. "It's Caroline," she said, her voice neutral. "She wants to meet." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Magnolia Estate's floor-to-ceiling windows. Ava sat at a table in the empty main hall, her laptop open as she reviewed upcoming events. The click of heels on hardwood made her look up. Caroline Prescott entered, looking different from the night of the gala. Her designer clothes were still immaculate, but her shoulders drooped slightly, and her usual confident stride seemed forced. She clutched her leather handbag like a shield. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Caroline said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. Ava gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit." Caroline perched on the edge of the seat, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. The vast room felt even larger in the uncomfortable silence between them. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Caroline began, her words carefully measured. About what happened at the gala. Ava closed her laptop and folded her hands on the table, giving Caroline her full attention. The same calm dignity that had carried her through the gala night remained evident in her posture. I didn't mean what I said, Caroline continued, her voice cracking slightly. I was frustrated. The table placement, the timing of the courses. She trailed off, perhaps hearing how trivial these complaints sounded. The service was actually impeccable that night, Ava noted quietly. Every member of our staff performed their duties professionally. Caroline's cheeks flushed. Yes, I know that now. I was being unreasonable. And racist, Ava added firmly. Caroline flinched at the word. I didn't intend. But you were, Ava interrupted, her voice still measured but firm. Your words weren't just about service or timing. They carried assumptions and prejudices that hurt not just me, but everyone who heard them. Caroline's fingers twisted in her lap. I don't consider myself a racist, Ava supplied. Most people don't, but our actions and words matter more than our self-image. Sunlight shifted across the polished floors as clouds passed overhead. In the distance, a clock ticked steadily. I was frustrated, Caroline repeated, softer this time. Ava leaned forward slightly. Your frustration isn't an excuse. Words matter, especially when you hold influence. Caroline's shoulders slumped further as she stared at her manicured hands. The carefully constructed walls she'd maintained began to crack, and raw emotion seeped through. I don't know why I acted that way, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast room. Maybe. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Maybe I am bitter. The admission seemed to surprise even Caroline herself. She reached up to brush away an unexpected tear, smudging her expensive mascara. Everything in my life looks perfect from the outside, she continued, her voice growing stronger but more pained. The house, the clothes, the social circle. But I'm alone, really alone. She gave a hollow laugh. I lost my family 5 years ago. Car accident. And instead of dealing with it, I just got meaner. Ava's expression remained composed, but her eyes softened slightly. The late afternoon light caught the tears now flowing freely down Caroline's cheeks. But what I said to you, that was different. That was worse. And I knew it even as I was saying it. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Caroline wiped her eyes with a designer handkerchief. Outside, birds chirped in the magnolia trees that gave the estate its name. I've been horrible, Caroline said. Not just at the gala, for years. And I've been making excuses, telling myself it was okay because I was hurting. But it's not okay. None of it was okay. Ava sat quietly, letting Caroline's words hang in the air between them. Her fingers were laced together on the table, neither reaching out nor pulling away. I see you here, Caroline gestured around the elegant room, running this beautiful place, making a difference in people's lives. And I'm just spreading bitterness, using my pain as a weapon against others. She took a shaky breath. I don't want to be that person anymore. I really don't. Ava studied Caroline's face for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was firm, but not unkind. Acknowledging the problem is only the first step. Ava leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes intense as she studied Caroline's tear-stained face. The afternoon light streaming through the estate's windows cast long shadows across the polished wooden table between them. Words are important, Ava said carefully, measuring each syllable. But actions speak louder. If you're serious about change, prove it. Let's create something that matters. Caroline dabbed at her eyes with the handkerchief again. Create something. Yes. Ava's voice grew stronger, more passionate. You have connections, resources, influence. Instead of using those things to tear people down, use them to build something meaningful. Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I wouldn't know where to start. The scholarship program I'm working on, Ava explained, spreading her hands on the table. It needs funding, yes, but more than that. It needs advocates. People who can open doors, make introductions, change minds. A flash of fear crossed Caroline's face. I don't know if I'm the right person. After everything I've done. That's exactly why you might be the right person, Ava countered. You understand privilege now in a way you didn't before. You've seen both sides, being the person causing harm and now, hopefully, being the person who wants to make amends. Caroline's fingers twisted the handkerchief nervously. People won't trust me. No, they won't, not at first. Ava's honesty was gentle but unflinching. Trust has to be earned. But imagine the impact if someone like you stood up and not only admitted to being wrong, but actively worked to create positive change. The clock ticked steadily as Caroline absorbed these words. Outside, a warm breeze rustled through the magnolia trees, carrying the sweet scent of their blooms through an open window. It would be hard, Caroline whispered, more to herself than to Ava. Yes, it would. Real change always is. Ava sat back in her chair. But you said you don't want to be that person anymore. This is your chance to become someone different. Caroline looked around the elegant room, taking in the carefully curated decor, the photographs of happy events on the walls, the sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from every corner. Her gaze finally returned to Ava's steady presence. I don't want to be this person anymore, Caroline said softly, but with growing conviction. Her hand stopped fidgeting with the handkerchief, and she straightened her shoulders slightly. The news of Caroline Prescott joining forces with Ava Reynolds spread through social media like wildfire. Comments ranged from skeptical to outright hostile. Another rich white woman trying to buy her way out of racism, one tweet read. Watch this partnership fall apart in a month, predicted another. Local news outlets picked up the story, running headlines like, Socialite's sudden change of heart, genuine or PR stunt? The morning shows dissected every aspect of the gala incident, replaying eyewitness accounts of Caroline's behavior. At the Magnolia Estates weekly staff meeting, even Ava's trusted employees expressed concern. Naomi Carter, sitting beside Ava at the conference table, voiced what many were thinking. Are you sure about this? Naomi asked, her forehead creased with worry. Caroline Prescott isn't exactly known for her follow-through on charitable causes. Leo, their events coordinator, nodded in agreement. Remember when she promised to chair that hospital fundraiser last year? She quit 2 weeks in because the meetings were too early. Around the table, heads bobbed in recognition of Caroline's reputation. The morning light streaming through the windows cast a warm glow on their troubled faces. I understand everyone's concerns, Ava said, her voice calm and steady. She stood up, smoothing her navy blazer. But this isn't about Caroline's reputation, or even about making her look good. Claire, their newest hire, spoke up hesitantly. But what if she's just using you? Using us? Ava walked to the window, looking out at the garden where the magnolia trees were in full bloom. You all know me, she said, turning back to face her team. You know I wouldn't agree to this if I didn't believe it could create real change. But the thing she said at the gala... Leo trailed off, uncomfortable. Yes, the things she said were horrible, Ava acknowledged. And she'll have to own that. But if we want to create real change in this community, we need people like Caroline Prescott to do more than just apologize. We need them to act. Naomi leaned forward, her silver bracelets clinking against the table. The public's not buying it, Ava. They think it's just another wealthy person's redemption tour. Let them think what they want. Ava replied, returning to her seat. This isn't about appearances. It's about the work. Caroline and Ava begin working together to establish a foundation supporting marginalized youth. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Magnolia Estates conference room as Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Spreadsheets and grant proposals covered the table, and her head was swimming with unfamiliar terms and concepts. So, we need to establish clear criteria for scholarship eligibility, Ava explained, pointing to a document. These young people often face systemic barriers that traditional applications don't account for. Carolyn nodded, though her usual confidence was notably absent. She picked up one of the student testimonials and read it carefully, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. I had no idea some of these kids were dealing with so much. That's why personal essays and interviews are crucial, Ava said, making notes on her tablet. Test scores and GPAs don't tell the whole story. As they worked through the morning, Caroline found herself stumbling over conversations about privilege and systemic inequalities. During a discussion about outreach programs, she interrupted Ava. But why can't they just apply online like everyone else? Ava set down her pen and looked at Caroline directly. Not everyone has reliable internet access at home. Some families share one computer, if they have one at all. Caroline's face flushed. Oh, she said quietly, embarrassment creeping into her voice. I didn't think about that. The foundation planning continued into the afternoon. They reviewed budgets, discussed board member selections, and outlined community engagement strategies. Caroline insisted on taking notes herself, though she usually delegated such tasks to assistants. During a break, Caroline walked to the window, clutching her coffee cup. When I was growing up, she said, almost to herself, my father always said anyone could succeed if they just worked hard enough.
Ava joined her at the window. And now?
Now I'm realizing how much I took for granted. Caroline turned to face Ava. Simple things, like having a quiet place to study, or never worrying about where my next meal would come from. They returned to work, tackling the Foundation's mission statement. Caroline suggested wording that emphasized helping the less fortunate, but Ava gently steered her toward language about creating opportunities and dismantling barriers. As the day wore on, Caroline's designer blazer came off, her sleeves were rolled up, and her perfectly styled hair became slightly disheveled. She threw herself into the work with unexpected determination, asking questions and taking criticism with growing grace. When Naomi brought in afternoon coffee, she raised an eyebrow at the sight of Caroline Prescott, surrounded by sticky notes and research papers. Her usual polish replaced by genuine engagement. By late afternoon, they had drafted initial proposals for the foundation structure and programs. Caroline rubbed her temples, looking at the mountain of work still ahead. She turned to Ava with a tired smile. This is harder than I thought, she admitted, but it feels right. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the steps of the Magnolia Estate as Caroline faced a small crowd of reporters. Their microphones pointed at her like accusing fingers, cameras flashing with unrelenting intensity. She smoothed her navy blue dress, a far cry from her usual flashy attire. Mrs. Prescott, isn't this just damage control? A reporter called out. A PR stunt to salvage your reputation? Yeah, Caroline's hand trembled slightly as she gripped the podium. In the past, she would have responded with defensive anger or dismissive hauteur. Instead, she took a deep breath, remembering her recent conversations with Ava about authenticity. I understand your skepticism, she said, her voice steady but humbler than anyone had ever heard it. For a long time, I lived in a bubble of privilege, never questioning my assumptions or recognizing how my words and actions affected others. Another reporter pressed forward. What about your behavior at the charity gala? The racial implications of your comments? Caroline felt her chest tighten, but she didn't dodge the question. What I said that night was inexcusable. I hurt someone who showed me nothing but professionalism and kindness. She paused, swallowing hard. I'm not here to make excuses or ask for forgiveness. I'm here because I'm learning, and I want to do better. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. How can we trust that this isn't just another wealthy person's vanity project? You can't, Caroline replied honestly. Not yet. Trust has to be earned through actions, not words. That's something else I'm learning. She gestured to the foundation's proposal documents in front of her. This foundation isn't about me. It's about creating real opportunities for young people who face real barriers. From the entrance of the Magnolia estate, Ava watched the press conference unfold. She noticed the absence of Caroline's usual designer jewelry, the way she maintained eye contact with the reporters instead of looking down on them. When Caroline stumbled slightly over terms like systemic inequality and institutional barriers, she didn't try to fake expertise, but admitted to being on a learning journey. The Foundation's board will be led by community members with lived experience, Caroline explained, referring to her notes with careful attention. My role is to listen, learn, and provide resources where they're needed most. Caroline's shoulders tensed, but she didn't deflect. I would say they have every right to be suspicious. My past behavior doesn't inspire confidence. She straightened her posture. But I'm not asking anyone to forget what I did. I'm asking for the chance to put my resources toward meaningful change, under the guidance of people who actually understand what's needed. As the questions continued, Ava studied Caroline's body language and responses. Gone was the defensive posture, the entitled tone, the reflexive need to control the narrative. In their place was something new: humility, sincerity, and a willingness to acknowledge her own limitations. The final question came from a blogger known for his harsh critiques of performative activism. Why should anyone believe you've changed? Caroline's response was immediate and unscripted. I'm learning, and I want to do better. That's all I can offer right now. My commitment to keep learning, to keep listening, and to put in the work, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. As the reporters began to disperse, Ava watched Caroline step away from the podium. Her usual polished facade had cracked, revealing something more authentic underneath. Something that, despite all odds, looked a lot like genuine growth. Standing in the doorway of her beloved venue, Ava allowed herself a small smile. Maybe, she thought, she's finally changing. The afternoon light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Magnolia Estates conference room, where Caroline sat surrounded by spreadsheets and donor files. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed the latest pledge confirmations. The Henderson Foundation had just committed $500,000 to their youth education initiative. Caroline's hands shook slightly as she double-checked the numbers. After weeks of meetings, phone calls, and detailed presentations, her networking efforts had finally paid off. It wasn't just about throwing money at a problem anymore. She understood that now. Each dollar represented real opportunities, scholarships, mentorship programs, and resources for young people who needed them most. The door opened, and Ava walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of Caroline, noting the scattered papers and the intense focus in the older woman's eyes. It was a far cry from the Caroline who had once demanded special treatment at every turn. The Henderson Foundation just confirmed, Caroline said, looking up. Her voice carried none of its former smugness, replaced instead by quiet satisfaction. $500,000, specifically for the education programs we discussed. Ava settled into the chair across from her, taking a moment to process the news. That's significant, she said, studying Caroline's face. How did you convince them? I didn't try to control the narrative this time, Caroline replied, removing her glasses. I let Marcus Henderson speak with some of the youth representatives we interviewed. Their stories were more powerful than any pitch I could have made. That couldn't have been easy for you, Ava observed, remembering how Caroline used to dominate every conversation. Stepping back, letting others take the lead. Caroline's fingers traced the edge of her coffee cup. 6 months ago, I would have thought I knew better than everyone else in the room. She paused, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. I probably would have talked over those kids, tried to tell their stories for them. But their voices, they know what they need better than I ever could. Ava nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. You're starting to get it, she said softly. This work isn't about being the hero or controlling everything. It's about creating space for voices that need to be heard. I still make mistakes, Caroline admitted, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Yesterday, I caught myself interrupting during the board meeting. Old habits die hard, I suppose. But you caught yourself, Ava pointed out. That's what matters. The Caroline I met at the gala wouldn't have even noticed. Caroline reached for one of the youth testimonials they'd collected, reading over the words she'd come to know by heart. When Jessica talked about having to choose between buying textbooks and helping her mom with rent, she shook her head. I never had to make choices like that. I never even thought about people having to make choices like that. And now? Now I understand that my role isn't to sweep in and fix everything my way, Caroline said. It's to listen, learn, and use whatever resources I have to support real solutions. Ava watched as Caroline carefully organized the papers, handling each testimonial with genuine respect. There was a new lightness to her movements, a sense of purpose that had replaced her former rigid control. Caroline looked up, meeting Ava's gaze. A small, genuine smile crossed her face. Not the practiced social smile she'd worn like armor at countless charity events, but something real and warm. For the first time since they'd started working together, she felt truly centered, as if all the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. Caroline decides to donate a significant portion of her personal wealth to the foundation, surprising Ava and the team. The morning sun cast long shadows across Caroline's home office as she reviewed her financial portfolio with her wealth manager, Thomas. Stacks of documents covered her mahogany desk, each representing different investments and assets accumulated over decades. Are you absolutely certain about this, Caroline? Thomas asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. This is nearly 40% of your liquid assets we're talking about. Caroline's fingers traced the edge of a document outlining her proposed donation to the foundation. The number made her stomach flutter. $15 million. Just months ago, the thought of parting with such a sum would have seemed absurd. I've never been more certain, she replied, her voice steady. Besides, what am I saving it for? More galas where I can show off my jewelry. Thomas shuffled uncomfortably in his seat. Your lifestyle expenses can be scaled back, Caroline interrupted, thinking of her rarely used vacation homes and the fleet of luxury cars gathering dust in her garage. I've spent years accumulating things I don't need. Later that afternoon, Caroline walked into the Magnolia Estates main conference room, where Ava and the foundation's team were reviewing grant applications. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh flowers filled the air as afternoon light streamed through the windows. I have something to announce, Caroline said, clutching a leather portfolio to her chest. Her heart raced, but her voice remained clear and strong. I've decided to make a personal contribution to the foundation. Ava looked up from her laptop, her expression curious. That's generous, Caroline, but you don't need to. $15 million, Caroline stated, placing the portfolio on the table. I've already started the transfer process with my financial team. The room fell silent. Someone's pen clattered to the floor. Ava's eyes widened as she processed the number. "If I'm going to do this, I need to give it everything I have," Caroline continued, her hands steady as she opened the portfolio. "Not just my time or my connections, but my resources too. Real change requires real commitment." She spread out the documents, revealing detailed plans for how the money could be allocated: scholarship funds, mentorship programs, community development initiatives. Each proposal reflected hours of careful thought and consultation with community leaders. "I used to throw money at causes just to see my name on donor lists," Caroline admitted, her voice softening. "But this is different. I want this money to create lasting change, guided by the people who understand what's really needed." Ava stood slowly, walking around the table to examine the documents. Her expression remained measured, professional, though her eyes revealed a mix of surprise and careful consideration. "This is significant," Ava said, picking up one of the proposals. "But you understand this kind of donation will require oversight, accountability. We can't just—" "I know," Caroline nodded. "I'm not asking for control or special recognition. The money needs to serve the Foundation's mission, not my ego." The afternoon light shifted, casting golden highlights across the conference room table as Ava studied Caroline's face. She saw none of the entitled defensiveness that had once characterized their interactions, only sincere determination. "Money helps," Ava finally replied, her tone both appreciative and cautious. "But actions matter more." The Foundation's conference room buzzed with tension as community leaders gathered for their monthly meeting. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table where Caroline sat reviewing project proposals. Liam Oliver, a local civil rights activist known for his direct approach, leaned forward in his chair. His weathered face and graying temples spoke of decades fighting for change in the community. "I've been watching this Foundation's work," Liam said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet murmurs. "And I have concerns about the motivation behind it all." Caroline looked up from her papers, her shoulders tensing. "I'm open to feedback, Mr. Thompson." "Are you?" Liam raised an eyebrow. "Because from where I sit, this looks like a wealthy white woman trying to buy her way out of guilt. You can't just throw money at the problem." The room fell silent. Caroline's cheeks flushed as she felt all eyes turned to her. She gripped her pen tighter, trying to maintain her composure. "That's not what this is," she replied, her voice slightly shaky. "I'm committed to making real change." "Real change?" Liam scoffed. "Real change comes from understanding, from getting your hands dirty in the trenches, not from writing checks from your mansion." Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Caroline's throat tightened as she struggled to find the right words. "I know I have a lot to learn," she managed. "But I'm trying—" "Trying isn't enough," Liam interrupted. "Our community has seen too many rich folks come in with their grand plans and good intentions, only to disappear when the work gets hard." Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me," she mumbled, hurrying from the room. She found herself in the garden behind the Magnolia estate, breathing in the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Tears pricked at her eyes as she heard footsteps approaching. Ava appeared beside her, her presence calm and steady. "I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough," Caroline whispered, wiping at her eyes. Ava turned to face her, her expression both kind and resolute. "That's part of the work," she said firmly. "You do it because it's right, not because it's easy." Caroline volunteers at a community event hosted by the Foundation. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers set up tables for the Foundation's monthly meal service. Caroline stood behind the serving counter, fumbling with the plastic gloves that seemed determined not to cooperate with her manicured fingers. "Here, let me help," offered Maria, a regular volunteer, demonstrating the proper technique. Caroline smiled gratefully, though her discomfort showed clearly on her face. As people began filing in, Caroline's movements were stiff and mechanical. She struggled with portion sizes and worried about making eye contact. The steam from the food trays fogged up her designer glasses, and she felt completely out of her element. "Would you like some more vegetables?" she asked hesitantly to an elderly man. He looked up at her with kind eyes. "Yes, please. And maybe a story to go with it?" His gentle humor made Caroline relax slightly. "I'm afraid I'm not very good at this yet," she admitted. "Nobody is at first," he said. "I'm Lucas. Used to be a teacher at the high school for 30 years. As the line continued moving, Lucas shared stories about his students, many of whom now had children of their own. Caroline found herself drawn into his tales of classroom triumphs and community changes he'd witnessed over the decades. More people began sharing their stories. A young mother told Caroline about juggling night classes while raising 3 kids. A teenager spoke proudly about being the first in his family to go to college, thanks partly to a foundation scholarship. As the hours passed, Caroline's movements became more natural. She stopped worrying about her awkwardness and started really listening. Each person who came through the line was more than just someone receiving a meal. They were part of the community's living history. During a quiet moment, Caroline noticed an elderly woman struggling with her tray. Without hesitation, she stepped out from behind the counter. "Let me help you to your seat," Caroline offered, carefully balancing the tray. "Such a dear," the woman said, patting Caroline's arm. "I remember when this building was just an empty lot. Now look at it, full of life and helping hands." By the end of the service, Caroline's feet ached from standing, and her expensive blouse was splattered with food stains. But she felt something new, a warmth that had nothing to do with the steam tables. She found Ava reviewing donation forms near the entrance. "For the first time, I feel like I'm doing something real," Caroline said, removing her apron. Ava looked up, studying Caroline's face. She noticed the genuine light in Caroline's eyes, the relaxed set of her shoulders, and how she seemed unbothered by her disheveled appearance. She nodded, seeing glimpses of genuine change. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Magnolia Estates office. Ava sat behind her mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of grant proposals and foundation paperwork. Caroline occupied the leather chair across from her, fidgeting with the pearl necklace she always wore. They had been reviewing plans for the foundation's upcoming initiatives for hours. Charts and spreadsheets covered the desk between them, but Caroline seemed distracted, her usual sharp focus absent. "These outreach numbers look promising," Ava said, tapping a spreadsheet with her pen. When Caroline didn't respond, Ava set down her papers and really looked at her partner. Caroline's perfectly styled hair and designer outfit couldn't hide the uncertainty in her eyes. She stared at her hands, twisting her rings, a nervous habit Ava had noticed developing lately. "Caroline?" Ava prompted gently. Caroline drew a shaky breath. "Ava, I feel like I've been pretending my whole life. I don't even know who I am without this image I've built." The confession hung heavy in the air. Outside, a bird chirped, the sound stark against the office's silence. "What do you mean?" Ava asked, though she suspected she knew. "This person, this Caroline Prescott everyone knows." Caroline gestured at herself with a hint of disgust. "The clothes, the jewelry, the attitude. It's all been armor, protection." She paused, struggling to find the words. "After Thomas and Emily died, I just built walls, higher and higher." Ava nodded slowly, remembering the tragic car accident that had taken Caroline's husband and daughter 10 years ago. "I thought if I made myself untouchable, nothing could hurt me again," Caroline continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But all I did was hurt others, and myself." She stood abruptly, pacing the office. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she moved restlessly. The foundation work. It's shown me there's another way to live. But every time I try to let my guard down, I panic. What if people don't accept the real me? What if I don't even know who that is anymore? Ava watched Caroline's agitated movements, seeing past the perfect facade to the scared woman underneath. She recognized the vulnerability it took to voice these fears. Caroline stopped at the window, arms wrapped around herself. Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't recognize myself. All I see is this character I created. Ava rose from her desk and joined Caroline at the window. The estate's gardens stretched out below them, where early spring flowers were just beginning to bloom. The people who matter will respect the real you, Ava said, leaning forward. Start by taking off the mask. Caroline nodded, her resolve growing as she whispered, I think it's time. The Foundation's boardroom buzzed with quiet conversation as board members settled into their leather chairs. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, highlighting the polished conference table, where Ava and Caroline had carefully arranged their presentation materials. Ava noticed Caroline's hands trembling slightly as she organized her notes. Gone were the flashy rings and perfectly manicured nails. Caroline had opted for a simple, professional appearance today. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a modest navy blazer. Ready? Ava whispered, giving Caroline an encouraging nod. Caroline took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. As ready as I'll ever be. The board chairman, Mr. Peterson, called the meeting to order. Ms. Reynolds, Ms. Prescott, you have the floor. Ava began the presentation, outlining the stark statistics about educational disparities and career opportunities for young people of color in their community. Her clear, confident voice commanded attention as she clicked through carefully prepared slides. When it was Caroline's turn to speak, she pushed back her chair and stood. Her voice wavered slightly at first, but grew stronger with each word. I've spent the past few months listening and learning, Caroline began. I've heard stories from young people who face barriers I never had to consider. They have dreams just as big as anyone else's, but they lack the connections and opportunities that I took for granted. She moved around the table, making eye contact with each board member. This mentorship program isn't about handouts. It's about opening doors that have been historically closed. It's about sharing knowledge, networks, and resources that can change lives. The passion in Caroline's voice surprised even Ava. This wasn't the rehearsed speech they'd practiced. These words came straight from Caroline's heart. We've identified 20 successful professionals who are ready to serve as mentors, Caroline continued. Each will be paired with a student for a year-long program that includes career guidance, networking opportunities, and hands-on experience in their chosen field. Questions came from the board members, some pointed and challenging. Caroline handled each one with thoughtful consideration, demonstrating a deep understanding of the program's goals and potential impact. What makes this program different from existing initiatives? Asked one board member, leaning forward in his chair. The difference is in the commitment, Caroline replied. We're not just offering occasional meetings or workshops. We're creating lasting relationships that can transform lives. I know because I've seen it happening already in our pilot group. She shared stories from their initial mentorship pairs. A young artist who'd never considered gallery ownership until her mentor showed her the business side of art. A budding engineer who gained confidence through hands-on projects with her mentor. As the presentation concluded, the board members exchanged glances. Mr. Peterson called for a vote, and hands raised one by one around the table. The motion passes unanimously, he announced. Congratulations, ladies. When can you begin implementation? Relief and joy washed over Caroline's face. She turned to Ava, a genuine smile brightening her features for the first time in weeks. "We're really doing this," she said, her voice full of wonder and purpose. The morning sun filtered through Caroline's home office windows as she scrolled through another positive news article about the foundation. "Local foundation makes waves with innovative mentorship program," the headline read. Below it was a photo of her and Ava standing with their first group of mentorship participants. Caroline paused at the image, studying how different she looked now compared to just months ago. Her face seemed softer, more genuine. The forced society smile had been replaced by something real. Her assistant, Jenny, knocked and entered with the day's mail. "More coverage in the Business Journal," Jenny said, placing a stack of envelopes on the desk, "and several personal letters." Caroline began sorting through the mail, pausing at a plain white envelope with slightly messy handwriting. The return address was from a local high school. She opened it carefully, unfolding the lined paper inside. "Dear Ms. Prescott," the letter began, "my name is Luke Mason. I'm 17, and I received one of the Foundation's first scholarships. I wanted to write to thank you personally." Caroline settled back in her chair, adjusting her reading glasses. "Before this scholarship, college seemed impossible. My mom works 2 jobs, and even though I maintained straight A's, the cost of university was way out of reach. When I got the acceptance letter from the foundation," my mom cried. For the first time, I saw hope replace worry on her face. But it's not just about the money. The mentorship program connected me with Dr. Williams, a research scientist at the university. He's showing me what a career in biochemistry really looks like. He believes in me, and that means everything. I know there was controversy when you and Ms. Reynolds started the foundation. Some people doubted your intentions. But I want you to know that what you're doing is changing lives, mine included. Thank you for giving kids like me a chance. Sincerely, Luke Mason. Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she finished reading. She reached for her phone and quickly texted Ava, "Do you have time to meet today?" An hour later, they sat in Ava's office at the Magnolia Estate. Sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the fresh flowers on her desk. Caroline handed her Marcus's letter. As Ava read, Caroline walked to the window, looking out at the carefully tended gardens below. She thought about all the galas she'd hosted over the years, the countless checks she'd written for various causes, always more concerned with being seen as charitable than actually making a difference. "This," Caroline said softly, as Ava finished reading, turning back to face her. "This means more than all the galas and events I've ever hosted." The morning newspaper lay spread across Ava's desk, the op-ed's bold headline catching everyone's attention. Caroline Prescott's Foundation, Real Change or Just Good PR? The article, written by respected journalist Marcus Chen, questioned whether Caroline's transformation was genuine or simply a calculated move to repair her tarnished reputation. Naomi paced the office, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "This is exactly what we were worried about. The Foundation's work is getting lost in all this drama about Caroline." Ava picked up her coffee mug, taking a thoughtful sip. "The programs are working. The mentorship initiative is thriving. We can't let public opinion derail what we've built." "Social media is blowing up," said Derek, their communications director, scrolling through his phone. "Some people are defending her, citing the scholarship program's success. Others are bringing up the gala incident again." "What concerns me," Naomi added, "is how this affects our upcoming fundraising efforts. Some donors might get spooked by the controversy." Ava stood and walked to the window, watching students arrive for their afternoon mentoring sessions. "The real work happens right here, not in opinion pieces or Twitter debates." Her phone buzzed, a text from Caroline. "Have you seen it?" Before Ava could respond, Caroline appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, her usual confident posture diminished. She clutched a copy of the newspaper in her trembling hands. "I'll give you two some space," Naomi said, motioning to Derek to follow her out. Caroline sank into a chair, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's right, you know. The journalist. Everything he wrote about my past behavior, the way I treated people, it's all true." "That's not who you are anymore," Ava replied, sitting across from her. "Isn't it?" Caroline's voice cracked. "Maybe I'm fooling myself. These comments online, they're brutal. People are saying I'm using the foundation, using you, to make myself look better." She unfolded the newspaper, reading aloud. "While the Reynolds-Prescott Foundation's programs show promise, one must question whether Caroline Prescott's involvement serves the community or merely her own redemption narrative." Caroline let the paper fall to her lap. "I'm trying so hard to be different, to do better. But maybe—" She took a shaky breath. "I'm trying, but maybe I'm not the right person to lead this." Ava leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You've already shown you can change. Don't let other people's doubts make you doubt yourself. This isn't about proving them wrong. It's about making a difference." Caroline sat at the head of the conference table in the Magnolia Estates meeting room, facing 5 potential sponsors. Their expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, highlighting the tension in the room. Mr. Thompson, CEO of a local tech company, spoke first. "Why should we trust our money with someone who's shown such—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Questionable judgment?" Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she placed them flat on the table. She looked each person in the eye, taking a deep breath. "You're right to question my involvement," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. 6 months ago, I behaved abhorrently at an event in this very building. I was cruel to Ava Reynolds, making racist comments that were completely unacceptable." A murmur went through the room. Amelia, another potential sponsor, raised an eyebrow. "I was wrong," Caroline continued, "not just that night, but in how I've lived much of my life. I've been entitled, dismissive, and harmful to others. I'm working every day to be better, to understand my privileges, and use them to create real change." She pulled out a folder containing the Foundation's latest results. "But this isn't about me. It's about the 35 students who received scholarships last quarter. It's about the mentorship program that's helped 15 young people secure internships." Mr. Thompson leaned forward. "And how do we know this isn't just an expensive PR campaign?" "You don't," Caroline admitted. "All I can show you is our work and my commitment to it. I spend 3 days a week mentoring students myself. I've donated half my personal fortune to ensure these programs continue regardless of external funding." Amelia spoke up. "That's surprisingly honest." "I'm done pretending," Caroline replied. "I made mistakes, terrible ones. But I'm learning and I'm putting in the work, not for my image, but because it matters." The room fell quiet. Finally, Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. "Well, that's not the pitch I expected." "Neither did I," Amelia added, a small smile forming. "But it's refreshing to hear someone own their mistakes so completely." As the meeting concluded, 3 of the 5 sponsors had committed to supporting the Foundation's next initiative. Caroline gathered her materials, her hands still shaking slightly from the emotional toll of such honesty. Ava, who had been observing quietly from the corner, approached as the last sponsor left. She touched Caroline's shoulder gently. "That was brave," Ava said warmly. "This is how you rebuild trust." The community center buzzed with energy as people gathered for the Foundation's Youth Mentorship Showcase. Colorful displays lined the walls, showing the success stories of students who had benefited from their programs. Caroline stood near the refreshment table, watching as young participants proudly explained their achievements to visitors. Her emerald dress was simple now, lacking the flashy jewelry she once thought necessary. She'd learned that true elegance came from how you treated others, not what you wore. As she poured coffee for an elderly gentleman, she caught snippets of conversation about the foundation's impact. Henry William, a prominent local activist who had been one of their harshest critics, made his way through the crowd. Caroline's stomach tightened. She remembered his scathing comments from 6 months ago, calling the foundation a vanity project for a guilty conscience. "Ms. Prescott," he said, approaching her with measured steps, "I've been following your work closely." Caroline set down the coffee pot, preparing herself for criticism. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming." "I was wrong about you," he said, his deep voice carrying weight. "When you started this, I thought it was just another rich person trying to buy good publicity." Caroline's shoulders relaxed slightly, but she remained cautious. "I understand why you felt that way. But these kids," he gestured to a group of teenagers excitedly showing their robotics project, "they tell me how you sit with them personally, how you listen, how you show up, not just with money, but with time and effort." A lump formed in Caroline's throat. She thought about the countless hours spent tutoring, the late-night phone calls helping students with college applications, the tears and triumphs she'd witnessed. "You've earned my respect," Henry said, extending his hand. "Not because you're perfect now, but because you're genuinely trying to be better." Caroline shook his hand, feeling the warmth of acceptance she'd never known she needed. Other community leaders who had gathered nearby nodded in agreement. Mrs. Rodriguez, a local teacher, stepped forward to share how the foundation's after-school program had transformed her students' lives. As Caroline listened to their stories, a quiet pride bloomed in her chest. Not the loud, showy pride of her past, but something deeper and more meaningful. She realized that true change wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about showing up day after day, doing the work, and earning trust one small action at a time. Looking around the room at the faces of people who had once doubted her, Caroline felt a sense of peace. The journey wasn't over, but she was on the right path. The auditorium of the Magnolia Estate hummed with excitement as 50 young faces looked up at the stage. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. Caroline stood at the podium, her hands steady now where they once might have trembled. "When I was your age," she began, her voice clear and honest, "I thought I had all the answers. I grew up with privilege, but that didn't protect me from pain." She paused, letting her gaze meet the curious eyes before her. "When I lost my family, I built walls. I became someone I'm not proud of." The room fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of feet stilled as Caroline continued. "But life has a way of teaching us lessons, sometimes through people we least expect." She glanced at Ava, who stood nearby, offering an encouraging nod. Ava stepped forward next, her presence commanding yet gentle. "My journey started in a small town where opportunities were scarce," she shared, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "People told me what I couldn't do, where I didn't belong." She smiled, her eyes bright with determination. "But every no became fuel for my yes." After the speeches, Caroline and Ava moved among the students, listening to their stories and dreams. A young girl with braids spoke about wanting to become a doctor. A shy boy in glasses shared his passion for computer programming. Each student received their full attention, their hopes taken seriously. As the event wound down and the last students filed out with their mentorship packets, Caroline turned to Ava in the now quiet auditorium. Emotion made her voice soft as she said, "I couldn't have done this without you." Ava's response was gentle but firm. You did the work. I just showed you the way. The conference room at the Magnolia Estate buzzed with excitement. Ava's team gathered around the large oak table, champagne flutes filled with sparkling cider catching the afternoon light. The mood was electric as Caroline entered, clutching a folder to her chest, her face glowing with barely contained joy. "It's official," she announced, her voice trembling slightly. "The Henderson Foundation has pledged $5 million over the next 3 years." The room erupted in cheers. Naomi, sitting beside Ava, grabbed her friend's hand and squeezed it tight. Tears welled in Ava's eyes as she watched her staff celebrate. People who had been with her since the beginning, who had weathered doubt and criticism alongside her. "This means security for all our programs," Ava explained to the group, her voice steady despite her emotion. "The mentorship program, the scholarships, the community outreach, everything we've built together is now guaranteed to continue." "You proved us wrong," he said simply. "You showed up every day and did the work." Later, as the team filtered out, Ava found Caroline standing by the window, looking out over the estate's gardens. The late afternoon sun caught the silver in her hair, which she'd stopped coloring months ago. Her posture was different now, less rigid, more natural. "Remember when you first came here?" Ava asked, joining her at the window. Caroline laughed softly. "I was horrible, so focused on having the perfect table at a charity event that I couldn't see what really mattered." "And now look at you," Ava said. "Leading donor meetings, mentoring students, showing up at 6 a.m. to serve breakfast at the community center." Caroline turned to face Ava, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "For the first time in years, I feel like I have a purpose." The evening sun cast long shadows across the Magnolia Estate's garden as Caroline and Ava walked along the winding path. The autumn air carried the sweet scent of late-blooming jasmine, and fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet. Caroline had been unusually quiet all afternoon, lost in thought as they reviewed the Foundation's latest success stories. Finally, she stopped near an old oak tree, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. "Can we talk for a moment?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ava nodded, noting the tension in Caroline's shoulders. They settled onto a nearby wooden bench, the same one where they'd had countless conversations over the past year. "I've been thinking about that night," Caroline began, her voice thick with emotion. "The gala, the way I treated you." She paused, swallowing hard. "Every time I see you working with the students or leading a meeting, I remember how cruel I was, how I spoke to you like you were beneath me." Tears welled in her eyes as she continued. "I'll never forgive myself for how I treated you." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Ava watched a leaf spiral down from the oak tree, taking her time before responding. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "You don't need my forgiveness," Ava said, turning to face Caroline fully. "You needed to forgive yourself." Caroline wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers. "How can I? The things I said." "The woman who said those things isn't who you are anymore," Ava replied. "I've watched you change, Caroline. Not just in big ways, but in small ones too. The way you listen to people now, how you think before you speak, the genuine care you show for our students." Caroline stared down at her hands, now clasped tightly in her lap. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still that person, just waiting to mess up again." "We all carry our past with us," Ava said, "but it doesn't have to define our future. You've proven that every day for the past year." "I think," she said slowly, a small smile forming on her lips, "I think I'm ready to move forward." At the Foundation's annual gala, Ava and Caroline reflect on how far they've come. The Magnolia Estate sparkled under crystal chandeliers as guests filled the grand ballroom for the Foundation's annual gala. The space looked different from that fateful night a year ago. Warmer somehow, with photographs of smiling students and success stories decorating the walls. Caroline adjusted her navy blue gown, no longer adorned with flashy jewelry, but wearing a simple pendant that one of their mentorship students had made. She watched from the side of the stage as Ava took her place at the podium, commanding the room's attention with her natural grace. Ava wore a flowing white dress that seemed to glow under the lights. Her eyes swept across the crowd, taking in the familiar faces, community leaders, students, donors, and volunteers who had become part of their extended family. "A year ago, I stood on this very stage," Ava began, her voice clear and strong. "That night marked the beginning of an unexpected journey." She paused, sharing a meaningful look with Caroline. "Many of you witnessed what happened here. You saw conflict and hurt. But what you didn't see was the potential for transformation that lay beneath the surface." The room fell silent, hanging on her every word. Even the servers paused their rounds, drawn in by the power of her presence. Since then, we've provided scholarships to 57 students. We've launched mentorship programs that have touched hundreds of lives. We've created job training initiatives that have helped families break cycles of poverty. Ava's voice grew warmer with each accomplishment. But our greatest achievement isn't in the numbers. It's in the hearts and minds we've changed, including our own. Caroline felt tears welling up in her eyes as Ava continued. "When we choose compassion and action, we create a better world," Ava said, her words resonating through the ballroom. "Not through grand gestures alone, but through daily choices to understand, to grow, to do better. Each time we choose to listen instead of judge, to learn instead of assume, to act instead of ignore, we move forward together." After the speech, as the crowd mingled and celebrated, Caroline found Ava near the garden doors. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine through the open windows, reminding them both of their many conversations in that garden. Caroline's eyes shimmered with emotion as she turned to Ava. "This work has changed my life," she said softly, the words coming from deep within her heart. Ava smiled warmly, placing a gentle hand on Caroline's arm. "And now, we'll keep changing others' lives, together." If you enjoyed the story of Ava Reynolds, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.